fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen stared at the rejection letter on her computer screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her cold coffee, her eyes scanning the words she had already read 20 times. "We regret to inform you that your research grant application has been denied. 3 years of groundbreaking cancer treatment research, countless sleepless nights, and promising preliminary results, all of it could disappear because of budget cuts and bureaucracy." Sarah glanced at the framed photo on her desk, her mother, smiling weakly from a hospital bed, taken just weeks before she lost her battle with pancreatic cancer. "I won't give up, Mum," she whispered, her jaw set with determination. Across town, in a gleaming skyscraper that pierced the San Francisco skyline, Maxwell Stone was ending someone's career with the same casual ease with which most people ordered coffee. "Incompetence costs money, and money is something I don't waste," he said, his steel grey eyes fixed on the trembling executive before him. At 35, Maxwell had built Stone Technologies into a $50 billion empire, earning himself a reputation as brilliant, ruthless, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Sir," his assistant interrupted, entering his office after a sharp knock, "the board meeting starts in 5 minutes, and Dr. Williams asked me to remind you about your sister's test results." Maxwell's facade cracked for just a moment at the mention of his sister, but he quickly recovered. "Tell them I'll be there shortly," he replied, dismissing both his assistant and the now former executive with a wave of his hand. As the door closed behind them, he turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection superimposed over the city sprawling below. Back in her lab, Sarah was frantically running calculations. Without funding, she had 3 weeks before she'd have to shut down her research. Her team of 4, all passionate scientists who'd taken pay cuts to work on this project, would need to find new positions. But it was the patients who would suffer most. Her treatment showed promise in targeting aggressive cancers that had proven resistant to traditional therapies. Dr. Chen, her youngest researcher Tom, poked his head into the lab. "There's someone here to see you. Says he's from Stone Technologies." Sarah frowned. She hadn't applied for any private sector grants, especially not from Stone Technologies. Their reputation for acquiring and dismantling smaller companies was well known in the Bay Area. Still, at this point, she couldn't afford to turn away any potential funding opportunity. "Send them in," she said, quickly straightening her lab coat and running a hand through her dark hair. She hadn't slept properly in days, and she knew she looked it. The man who walked in wasn't a corporate representative as she'd expected. It was Maxwell Stone himself, his bespoke suit worth more than her monthly salary, his presence filling the modest lab like a storm cloud, threatening rain. Then followed a thorough inspection by a 3D printer. "Dr. Chen," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "I have a business proposition for you." Maxwell Stone's expensive leather shoes clicked against the lab's linoleum floor as he circled Sarah's workspace like a shark. "Your research is impressive, Dr. Chen, innovative, revolutionary even." He paused, picking up a petri dish before Sarah could stop him. "And completely worthless without proper funding." Sarah's throat tightened. "Mr. Stone, if you're interested in investing in our research, I'm not." He set down the dish with deliberate slowness. "I'm interested in making you a different kind of offer. $2 million to be exact." Marcus was a man of property, and he had not been pleased by the offer from someone like Hatterless, unless it was real. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. That kind of money would fund her research for years. "What's the catch?" "I need an heir," Maxwell stated flatly, "and I need a surrogate to carry it. You're healthy, intelligent, and desperate. It's a perfect match." The heir seemed to vanish from the room. Sarah stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but his expression remained serious. "You want me to be a surrogate? 9 months of your time in exchange for $2 million. His lips curved into a cruel smile. "Think of it as a sabbatical from your noble pursuits." "How many hundreds of people are still living, butchered by truckloads of incredible and expensive clogs and machinery?" Sarah's cheeks burned as she caught his meaning. He wanted to humiliate her, to reduce a brilliant scientist to nothing more than a biological incubator. The worst part was that he knew she couldn't refuse. It was the first time Sarah realized she was acting on her own. "Me?" she managed to ask. Maxwell's eyes glittered with malice. "Let's call it a social experiment. How far will a decorated researcher go to save her precious project? Besides," he added, examining his manicured nails, "it amuses me to see someone so accomplished reduced to such a basic biological function." Sarah's hands clenched into fists beneath her lab coat. She thought of her mother, of all the patients waiting for a breakthrough, of her team counting on her. "When do you need an answer?" He pulled a thick contract from his briefcase. "Time is money, Dr. Chen, and I'm already wasting both." The next hour passed in a blur of legal jargon and mounting dread. Sarah read every page, her scientific training refusing to let her skip a single clause. Maxwell watched her with obvious satisfaction, enjoying her discomfort. "Last page, Dr. Chen," he said eventually. "Just your signature, and you can start saving lives with my money." Marcus started writing. Sarah's hand shook as she gripped the pen. The contract was comprehensive: artificial insemination, strict health protocols, complete confidentiality, $2 million upon successful delivery, no private employers nor Custer allowed to invade the privacy of what had been her keeping for so many months. "I don't want anything." "Having second thoughts?" Maxwell taunted softly. "Perhaps you're not as dedicated to your cause as you claim." Sarah thought of the rejection letter still glowing on her computer screen, of her mother's last words, "Promise me you'll help others, sweetheart." With a swift motion, she signed her name. "Excellent," Maxwell said, gathering the contract. "My driver will pick you up tomorrow morning. Pack for an extended stay. You'll be moving into my guest house for the duration of the pregnancy." He headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and, Dr. Chen, do try to remember that for the next 9 months, your primary value lies in something considerably more basic than your PhD." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Sarah alone with the echo of her mother's voice and the bitter taste of pride swallowed in the name of something greater than herself. Maxwell's mansion loomed before Sarah like a modern fortress of glass and steel, perched on the hills overlooking San Francisco Bay. The driver unloaded her modest luggage, mostly books and research papers, while the housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, waited with poorly concealed curiosity. "Your quarters are in the East Wing," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, leading Sarah through corridors that cost more than her entire career's research funding. "Mr. Stone insists that you take your meals in your suite unless specifically invited. Otherwise," the guest house turned out to be a fully equipped apartment within the mansion. Despite its luxury, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being a prisoner in a gilded cage. Her lab had been relocated to a sterile room in the basement, a concession she'd fought for in the contract negotiations. The first month passed in a blur of medical appointments and awkward encounters. Maxwell treated her like a business transaction, checking on his investment through daily reports from his medical team. Their only interactions were during mandatory weekly meetings, where he reviewed her health metrics like quarterly earnings reports. "Your hormone levels are suboptimal," he announced during one such meeting, not looking up from his tablet. "The doctor suggests reduced work hours." "My research doesn't affect the pregnancy," Sarah argued, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The preliminary results show." "The preliminary results are irrelevant compared to my heir's well-being," Maxwell cut her off. "Or do I need to remind you of our agreement?" But fate had other plans. In the 3rd month, Sarah experienced severe morning sickness that left her bedridden for days. One morning, as she lay reviewing research data on her tablet, Maxwell unexpectedly appeared at her door. "Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned you haven't eaten," he said stiffly, setting down a bowl of soup. The chef made it following the doctor's specifications. Sarah was too surprised to respond immediately. It was the first time he had shown any personal concern. As she reached for the bowl, her tablet slipped, displaying her latest research findings. Maxwell caught a glimpse of the complex molecular diagrams. "Is that your cancer treatment model?" "Yes," Sarah answered, expecting dismissal. Instead, Maxwell picked up the tablet, his brow furrowed. "This targeting mechanism, it's unlike anything I've seen in biotech. It uses a novel approach to cellular recognition, Sarah explained, professional excitement momentarily overriding their awkward relationship. "We're essentially teaching the immune system to identify cancer cells through multiple markers simultaneously." For the first time, Maxwell looked at her, really looked at her with something approaching respect. "Walk me through it." That conversation marked a subtle shift. Maxwell began stopping by more frequently, initially under the pretense of monitoring her health. Their discussions grew longer, ranging from biotechnology to artificial intelligence. Sarah discovered that beneath his arrogant exterior lay a brilliant mind capable of grasping complex scientific concepts with surprising speed. But complications arose in the 5th month. Sarah developed gestational diabetes, requiring constant monitoring. One evening, as she worked in her lab, despite doctor's orders, Maxwell found her analyzing blood samples. "You should be resting," he said, but the usual coldness in his voice had softened. "I had an idea about adapting the treatment protocol," Sarah replied, not looking up. "If we can modify the delivery mechanism to account for—" She swayed slightly, steadying herself against the lab bench. Maxwell was at her side instantly, his hand on her elbow. "Enough. You're pushing yourself too hard." "That's rich coming from you," Sarah retorted, but allowed him to lead her to a chair. "Wasn't it you who said my only value was as an incubator?" Something flickered across Maxwell's face. Was it shame? He started, then stopped. For the first time in his life, Maxwell Stone seemed at a loss for words. The baby chose that moment to kick, making Sarah gasp. Without thinking, she grabbed Maxwell's hand and placed it on her swollen belly. They both froze, connected by this sudden intimate contact and the movement of the life they'd created through science, if not love. Maxwell withdrew his hand slowly, clearing his throat. "I'll have dinner sent down," he said quietly, "but please don't stay too late." As he left, Sarah noticed he'd left his suit jacket draped around her shoulders, protection against the lab's perpetual chill. The lab's emergency lights cast an eerie glow as Sarah worked late into the night, her 7-month pregnant form reflected in the darkened windows. The latest trial results showed promise her modified treatment protocol was showing unprecedented success in targeting aggressive cancer cells. "Just a few more tests," she muttered, fighting the dizziness that had been plaguing her all day. The room swayed slightly, but she gripped the lab bench tighter, determined to finish. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence as the test tube slipped from her trembling fingers. Sarah tried to step back, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Maxwell's horrified face as he burst through the lab doors. "Sarah," his voice cracked with an emotion she'd never heard before: fear. She awakened to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and Maxwell's disheveled form pacing beside her bed. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his hair mussed, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "You're awake," he breathed, immediately at her side. "The doctors say it's severe anemia and exhaustion. Why didn't you tell anyone you were feeling ill?" The research, Sarah started weakly. "Damn the research," Maxwell exploded, then immediately lowered his voice, conscious of her condition. He couldn't finish the sentence. A nurse entered with a tablet, interrupting the moment. "Dr. Chen, we need to review your medical history. I see you've done extensive research on pancreatic cancer treatment." "Yes," Sarah answered, watching Maxwell suddenly go very still. "My mother died from it. That's what inspired my research." Pancreatic cancer. Maxwell's voice was barely a whisper. "Your treatment, it targets pancreatic cancer, among others. The preliminary results show a 60% response rate in aggressive cases that didn't respond to traditional therapies." Maxwell sank into the chair beside her bed, his face ashen. "My sister Catherine, she has stage IV pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 3 months to live last week." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah struggled to sit up, her researcher's mind already racing. "The treatment isn't approved yet, but the trial data." "Show me," Maxwell demanded, then caught himself. "Please, show me everything." For the next hour, Sarah walked him through her research, her voice growing stronger as she explained the innovative approach that had consumed the last 3 years of her life. Maxwell listened with an intensity she'd never seen before, asking precise, intelligent questions that revealed both his technical brilliance and his desperate hope. "All this time," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "I treated you like you were nothing more than..." He couldn't finish the sentence. A walking incubator, Sarah supplied, but without bitterness. "I was wrong." The words seemed to cost him physically, so terribly wrong. "Your work. You could save Catherine. Save countless others." He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. "How did I not see it before?" "Pride has a way of blinding us," Sarah said softly, remembering her own struggle with accepting his offer. Maxwell stood abruptly and walked to the window. When he turned back, his face showed a vulnerability she'd never imagined him capable of. "I don't deserve to ask this, but would you be willing to include Catherine in your trial?" "On one condition," Sarah replied, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. "You treat me as a partner in this journey, not an investment." Maxwell crossed back to her bedside and, in a gesture that shocked them both, took her hand. "Not an investment," he agreed quietly. "A miracle worker." Catherine's response to the treatment was nothing short of remarkable. Within weeks, her tumors showed significant reduction, and Maxwell found himself spending evenings in Sarah's lab, poring over test results and treatment protocols. "The cellular response rate is unprecedented," Sarah explained one night, her 8-month pregnant form moving carefully between microscopes. Maxwell jumped up to steady her as she reached for a slide. "You should be resting," he said, but his tone held concern rather than command. "I rest better knowing we're making progress," she smiled, noticing his hand lingering supportively at her elbow. "Besides, your insights about AI-driven protein folding analysis have accelerated our research significantly." Maxwell's face darkened. "I should have offered that help months ago," instead of he trailed off, the weight of his past behavior heavy between them. "You're helping now," Sarah said simply. "That's what matters." The change in Maxwell became apparent to everyone around him. Mrs. Rodriguez found him bringing Sarah late-night snacks and research papers. His executive team was shocked when he postponed a major merger to attend Catherine's treatment session. Most surprisingly, he began reaching out to family members he'd pushed away years ago. "My cousin Thomas is a biochemist at Stanford," he mentioned one evening, as they shared dinner in Sarah's suite, now a regular occurrence. "He's offered to collaborate on scaling up the treatment production." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The same cousin you haven't spoken to in 5 years. Maxwell had the grace to look embarrassed. 7, actually. "I was difficult after my parents' death. Pushed everyone away, focused only on building the company." He met her eyes. "You've helped me see what I've been missing." Their intellectual discussions expanded beyond medical research. They debated ethics in technology, shared favorite books, and talked about their hopes for the baby. Maxwell found himself opening up about his past, his parents' tragic accident, his obsession with control, his fear of vulnerability. One evening, as they walked in the mansion's garden, Catherine joined them, her strength visibly returning. "You two," Catherine said, watching them argue good-naturedly about quantum computing, "remind me of Mom and Dad. They could debate for hours, but there was always such love in it." Maxwell and Sarah fell silent, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I should check on the latest trial results," Sarah said quickly, waddling toward the house. Sarah Maxwell called after her. She turned. "Thank you, not just for Catherine, but for showing me a better way to live." Catherine waited until Sarah was out of earshot. "You love her, don't you?" "It's not that simple," Maxwell protested, but his eyes followed Sarah's retreating form. "Actually, dear brother, it is that simple. You're just too proud to admit it." Catherine squeezed his hand. "Don't let pride cost you happiness again." That night, Maxwell stood in his study, looking at an old family photo. In it, his parents smiled broadly, surrounded by family at a holiday gathering. He picked up his phone and, for the first time in 7 years, called his aunt. "Martha, it's Maxwell. Yes, it's really me. I'd like to apologize, and I'd like you to meet someone special. 2 someone specials, actually. One's not here yet," but his voice cracked. "I've missed you all so much." In her suite, Sarah listened to his muffled voice through the wall, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick, as if in approval of its father's transformation. The emergency alarms blared through the mansion at 3 a.m., exactly 2 weeks before Sarah's due date. Maxwell burst into her suite to find her doubled over in pain, blood staining the sheets. "Something's wrong," she gasped, her face ashen. "The baby." "Forget the baby," Maxwell said fiercely, gathering her into his arms. "You're what matters." The hospital corridor became his personal hell as he paced outside the operating room. Catherine held his hand, her own health restored enough to be his strength now. "Mr. Stone," the doctor emerged, looking grave. "We need to perform an emergency C-section. There are complications, severe preeclampsia. We can save the baby, but Dr. Chen's condition is critical. We need you to make a choice." "Save her," Maxwell said without hesitation. "Do whatever it takes to save Sarah." Hours passed in agonizing slowness. When the doctor finally appeared again, Maxwell barely recognized his own voice as he asked, "Sarah?" "She's stable, but weak." "The next 24 hours are crucial," the doctor paused. "Your daughter is healthy, though small. Would you like to see her?" "My daughter," Maxwell's voice cracked. "She's alive too." In the NICU, Maxwell stood over the tiny incubator, watching his daughter's chest rise and fall. She was perfect, a miracle he didn't deserve, but his heart was in the ICU, where Sarah fought for her life. 3 days later, at a hastily called press conference, Maxwell Stone did something unprecedented. With Catherine beside him and his newborn daughter in the NICU above, he faced the media. "6 months ago, I made a contract with Dr. Sarah Chen, believing I could reduce one of the brightest scientific minds of our generation to nothing more than a surrogate. I was wrong. Not just wrong, I was cruel, arrogant, and blind. Dr. Chen's revolutionary cancer treatment has already saved my sister's life and will save countless others. But more than that, she saved me from my pride, from my isolation, from myself." His voice shook as he continued, "Dr. Chen is fighting for her life right now because of complications from giving birth to my daughter. A daughter who will grow up knowing that her mother is a hero and her father was a fool who learned to be better because of her mother's grace." He straightened his shoulders. "Effective immediately, Stone Technologies is establishing a $100 million fund for women in STEM, with Dr. Chen as director once she recovers, and she will recover. I'm also announcing full funding for her cancer treatment research and immediate fast-tracking through our biotech division." In her hospital room, Sarah watched the press conference on TV, tears sliding down her cheeks as she held their tiny daughter. When Maxwell entered moments later, she saw in his eyes what he hadn't said to the press, what he'd finally learned to say to those he loved. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he whispered, taking her hand. "Love isn't about deserving," Sarah replied softly. "It's about growing, learning, and choosing to be better. Together." 1 year later, Sarah stood at a podium, accepting the Breakthrough Prize in Life Sciences. In the front row, Maxwell held their daughter Emma, who clapped her tiny hands as her mother spoke about hope, science, and second chances. The trial results had exceeded all expectations. Sarah's treatment was now saving lives in hospitals across the country, with a global rollout planned for the following year. Catherine, now in complete remission, had become the Foundation's most passionate advocate. And none of this would be possible, Sarah concluded her speech, without the Stone Foundation's commitment to advancing women in STEM. Sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not just from scientific discovery, but from learning to see each other's true worth. At the reception, Maxwell watched Sarah move through the crowd of scientists and dignitaries, their daughter balanced on her hip. He remembered the man he'd been a year ago, so convinced of his own superiority, so blind to real value. "Your parents would be proud," Catherine said, joining him. "Both of Emma and of who you've become." The Stone Mansion had transformed along with its owner. The East Wing was now a fully equipped research facility, where Sarah led a team of brilliant scientists. The gardens echoed with Emma's laughter as she grew, doted on by both parents who had found an unexpected balance in their shared custody and deeper friendship. That evening, as they walked through the garden, where their story had shifted course a year ago, Emma toddled between them, her dark curls bouncing with each step. The new STEM scholarship program had over 1,000 applicants, Maxwell said, steadying Emma as she wobbled. Sarah smiled. A far cry from the man who once thought a woman's greatest value was as an incubator. "I thank God every day that you proved me wrong," he caught her hand, squeezing it gently. "You and Emma, you didn't just save my sister's life. You saved mine." Emma chose that moment to stumble into a flower bed, emerging with a fistful of crushed petunias and a triumphant grin. Her parents laughed together, the sound carrying across the garden like a promise-fulfilled proof that pride's walls could crumble in the face of love, respect, and the courage to change.